Thank you for joining us today for another Abundant Living podcast. I'm your host, Bruce Oliver. You have our promise to do our best to make the next few minutes of your time well spent. Our special guest is prepared to share a blessing with you. So let's jump in and get started. Our engine is warmed up and we are now leaving the station. Buckle up as we are beginning our Abundant Living podcast journey. Today, we're honored to have Dr. Catherine Wheeler. Dr. Wheeler's journey from performing abortions to becoming a passionate pro-life advocate is both profound and inspiring. Her work spans multiple pro-life organizations. Stay tuned for an enlightening conversation on a topic that touches many lives. Dr. Wheeler, can you introduce yourself to our listeners and share a bit about how we got connected?
Well, thank you, Dr. Oliver. Thanks for having me with you. I am a board-certified OBGYN physician. I practiced for 24 years in Salt Lake City, Utah. Part of that included in my training and early practice performing abortions on babies with special needs. We would have called that severe genetic anomalies and genetic syndromes. We connected through John DiGirolamo, who you got to interview regarding his authorship of his most recent book, It's Not About the Devil, where he shared stories about people impacted by evil in the modern world. And he shared my story as one of his chapters in that book.
Dr. Wheeler, I admire people who speak out against abortion. I believe abortion is wrong. Could you share your passion for speaking out as a pro-life doctor and the key moments that led to your change of heart?
Obviously, I haven't always been pro-life. I grew up in a minister's family and unfortunately turned away from God early in my life, in my late teens. And I really don't recall conversations about abortion. I was easy pickings when I went to medical school and was convinced that abortion was a good thing and a way to help women. My key turning points in some ways are similar to other abortionists that I've met. There seem to be these common themes. We all seem to have just picked up without even thinking about it, this idea, and even pride in the fact that we thought we were helping women by offering abortion. And then two things typically happened in all of our stories. First, something happened that made us critically aware of the baby, the human being in front of us, and secondly, that we were killing the human being in front of us. For me, the beginning of my turning point was very early in my career. As I said, I did abortions for babies with special needs, which is horrific. But one day I was convinced by a patient I just felt so sorry for, who was a teenager and wanted an abortion because she thought being pregnant would destroy her life. I tried to refer her. She said, no, you have to be the one. And in what I thought was compassion, I sat down to do her abortion one day. I was a non-Christian at the time, so I didn't really have a framework for what happened. All I can tell you is when I sat down to do that abortion, it was like the blinders came off, and I was acutely aware that there was a human being who I was about to kill. It was absolutely terrifying. If you can imagine that you're then sitting there going, do I proceed with what I've already started, and that this human being is going to die? And in the end, I did. I did complete that abortion, but it was absolutely terrifying. It was something that when we do things that are horrible, we tend to block it out of our mind. And I did that for 15 years until I became a Christian. And it wasn't like God immediately started to bring that up. But after a lot of healing from what was going on in my life at the time, he did, in his grace, start to bring it up. And that for me involved grieving over two babies I lost to miscarriage. And in the middle of praying to God about that grief that I'd never healed from, I literally heard from God, you're going to see these babies again. And being so delighted, but then I immediately heard you're also going to meet the babies you aborted. which, if you can imagine how terrifying that is, but God in his grace immediately said, and they love you. And I understood grace and forgiveness in that moment, something that I'll never take for granted. And the second thing was walking with a friend who also happened to be a doctor and hearing a story of somebody who was non-medical being invited to watch an abortion. Now, if you can imagine, people don't really understand what abortion is. So here's a non-medical person who thinks abortion's a really cool thing that helps women actually watching the killing of a baby. And the effect on her having witnessed that, if you can even imagine that. And I just said to myself, how could I ever have done anything so terrible? So those were my key moments. The last thing, I never wanted to talk about this, but I moved to Colorado 5 years ago, and we were in the midst of a ballot initiative to try to end abortion after a baby can survive outside the womb. I did not know there was a place in the world that allowed that. So I had to look up, like, how do you even get a baby that is that big out in an abortion? I had to look it up. It's absolutely barbaric and horrific, and so I knew that I needed to start sharing my story because people did not understand the humanity of the baby and how barbaric it is to take the life of a human being. So that's what God has called me into. That's where my passion comes from. I know that Jesus' heart is broken over the taking of life of children and the harms on all of us.
Dr. Wheeler, thank you so much for speaking from your heart. Now, I have a quick question, and I'm wondering, Dr. Wheeler, if you happen to know of someone, like a person that whose mother was considering to do an abortion and just didn't do it. Can you tell us somebody?
One of the ones I heard about not long ago is Steve Jobs before he died. I heard him speaking about the fact that he was adopted and how thankful he was to his birth mother, and how much he had hoped that he would be able to meet her to thank her for not aborting him. I always am a little bit hesitant to use famous people, but because ordinary people matter also. But I think his story is especially poignant, and most of us know him and the impact he's had on the world.
Thank you. I appreciate that help. Dr. Wheeler, what are some common arguments you face from the pro-choice side, and how do you respond to them?
We have to remember that on the pro-choice side, it's usually not evidence that we're dealing with or science. There's all these justifications. There's twisting and suppressing the truth about who is in the uterus, the fact that this is a developing human being, and about abortion, the procedure itself. And they all involve assuming that the preborn baby is not a human being of equal dignity and value as we are until after they're born. Or they completely ignore or discount the baby and only focus on the woman. They also hide the true meaning of abortion behind a sanitized word that means nothing to most people, and that we've been trained to think of as just choice. So we have to remember that people usually have not thought through their worldview, including abortion. I think it was Francis Schaeffer who said that we catch our worldview like people catch the flu from the people around us. That's my paraphrase. So most people just pick up whatever the culture says about what's true about the world. And so our job is to really help people think about their views. And first of all, you really want to care about the person, listen to their view with respect and interest, maybe ask them some questions to make sure you understand their view. And because most of them haven't thought about it, you can ask them what they base that on. What is their evidence? You're just helping them to start thinking through it. You learn to ask them questions, and at some point, you're going to understand what they're saying, and you can suggest, may I suggest an alternate view, or have you considered, and bring up some of the truths about abortion. Also, most people who are pro-choice have some limits to what they think abortion should be okay for, such as rape and incest. Most people don't think it's okay to do an abortion in the third trimester. So looking for that common ground and then walking them backwards. What's different about the baby at 28 weeks versus 20 weeks, and just helping them to think more clearly and giving them some alternate views. They're probably not going to change their mind immediately. They might, but it's in relationship that we feel safe to start considering alternative views.
Thank you so much for that information. That was very helpful. And the fact that people need to consider the baby as a living, distinct human being is so important. Now, I have a follow-up question here, if I could. I wonder if I could ask you, what pointers could you quickly share with our listeners about what you just said?
Yes, I think it's scary to start engaging in conversations. I know I was scared for a long time about that. If you really care about people, please step into these conversations and learn how to have them. For me, I joined the Colson Fellowship, if you know the Colson Fellowship for Worldview, and learned how to have these conversations in a respectful way. I've looked at Scott Klusendorf's work, Mark Newman's work, 40 Days for Life has great resources. Start learning the kinds of questions, what the arguments are that the pro-choice side will have. Start learning what's actually true so you can ask questions. I would encourage you to engage, learn, and engage again.
Thank you so much. And I really want to encourage our listening audience to go forward with what they're learning and share with others. Here's another question. What misconceptions about the pro-life movement do you encounter most frequently, and how do you address them?
Yes, thank you for that question. You know, I lived in the secular pro-choice world for a very long time, so I believed, without ever looking into it for myself, the lies about the pro-life movement and pregnancy resource centers. I really believed what I was told, that pro-life people didn't care about women, they only cared about saving babies, that the arguments were religious and they were just their own personal beliefs and shouldn't be imposed on other people. And now I tell people that the people who I've met in the pro-life movement are actually some of the kindest, most forgiving and gracious, generous, loving, accepting, non-judgmental people I've ever met. If there's anybody they should hate, it should be me, an ex-abortionist. Instead, they've been incredibly welcoming and opened their doors to me. I think what's unique about the pro-life movement is they're not fighting and demanding their own rights, but they're literally laying down their lives for women and unborn children, offering real help, caring, and hope. I have not found any coercion, especially in the pregnancy resource centers. I have found that they're the ones who are actually telling the whole truth to women, offering real choice, really listening and caring about the women. I've found that on the abortion side that it's much more coercive, and a lot of the facts are withheld from women. I've also learned that the pro-life stance is incredibly simple, and it is true, that the syllogism is that it's wrong to kill an innocent human being. Abortion kills an innocent human being, and therefore abortion is wrong. I want to pause for 1 second. I use the word kill, but and I know many people might be offended by that. I just don't know any other way to describe what it really is. I think we've sanitized it so much, but I don't mean any harm by that word. And I do want to point out that when I say this syllogism, that we have evidence for it. I'm not just saying that. It's not religious, although there is a religious basis if you want to look at the grounding, but it comes from science. From the instant of fertilization, a new, distinct, living, whole human being comes into existence at that very moment, separate from the mother. And from that instant, it is actually the baby that, through its DNA, is directing all of its own development. There are two human beings that we're talking about. And then secondly, philosophy tells us what we can do, how we should interact and treat other human beings. And it's important that we really live in a society where all human beings have equal dignity, worth, and value just because we're human beings, not because of my level of development, my size, whether I'm in the uterus or out of a uterus, or whether I can function like other human beings. The last thing I'd say is that induced abortion has one goal, and that is not just ending a pregnancy, which is the euphemistic term, because delivering at the end of a pregnancy also ends the pregnancy. But the whole goal of an induced abortion is to deliver a non-viable or dead baby. That's the primary intention.
Okay. I'm going to give you some extra time for this answer. Dr. Wheeler, let's dive into some of the challenges you've faced in your journey. Can you share a couple of insightful obstacles you had to face, and how did you manage to overcome them?
Thank you for that question, Dr. Oliver. My first obstacle was honestly within myself. Somebody asked me on a plane recently when I told them about my past doing abortions. They said, when you do something that awful, how do you get up? And that was my first obstacle, was there's so much shame and so much horror when you realize that you've actually taken the lives of human beings. So that was my first barrier, and I think that's a big thing that silences so many people. I've had people ask me, if abortion is so awful, why don't people speak about it? The abortion industry is really good about bringing up shame all the time and how people need to hide abortion and trying to normalize it. So it's the shame and the lack of healing. When God first brought this up, that he really wanted me to start sharing my past, my first response was, I don't do that anymore, God. I'm not going to talk about this. I quit doing it. Isn't that enough? But when we have those kinds of stories that God has redeemed, there are other people who are sitting in silence and shame, unhealed. And I think sharing that kind of a redemptive story and how God first has forgiven us, Jesus died for that, we can be reborn as new creations in a new life with a return of God's original intention for us, and that he uses even our most awful sins to further his kingdom, to bring healing and to bring Jesus to people who are hurting. So that's the first thing, is coming to the point where we're no longer ashamed to speak, where we know that we're forgiven and in a new life, and that God will use our stories to spare lives, to reveal truth, to for me to highlight the dignity and humanity of the baby from fertilization, to help activate people to get into pro-life work, especially helping single parents and women in difficult pregnancies, and to point people to Jesus, especially for healing. So that was my first obstacle. My second major one was the fact that I'd lived in the secular world far from God until my early 50s. And there was a lot of renewal of my mind that had to happen. I had believed those false beliefs, and I'm telling you, they dig in deeply into your mind. And so every one of those lies that I had believed had to be confronted by God, had to be exposed, confronted, removed, and replaced by the truth. So God had some work to do with me to confront every one of those excuses I had for why abortion was okay. And that was done by, first of all, returning to God. And so I would be in his word, which is the truth, and listening to the Holy Spirit. I became involved after moving to Colorado. I was pointed to the Colson Center for Christian Worldview and did a 10-month fellowship with them, which really helped me to understand God's kingdom, God's plan, who God is, and what the truth is. And then the other thing, and I would really encourage listeners to do this, I started looking myself at what I had been told, all of the lies I had been told through medical organizations and my training, and actually looking at the research for myself and looking at newer research. They tend to use old research and suppress the better research that pushes their abortion agenda. I started learning to critically think about these things for myself and really search for what is true. I thank God. It's been an incredible journey, but again, my key things were becoming a new creation in Christ, understanding forgiveness and God's love for me as being primary, letting him use his redemptive story in me to help others, and getting a renewed mind.
Thank you so much for becoming a new creation. Thank God. And how God has been renewing your mind and how you've been seeking after the truth. And God has been giving you what you need to have and meeting the right kinds of people that you can learn from. But now here you are going out and sharing the pro-life message, which is wonderful. You might be asked this question from time to time, and let me try to say this the best way I can and be sensitive. How could a doctor who's trained to save lives turn to performing abortions? And what do you think can shift someone's perspective on this issue?
Yeah, thank you. It doesn't make sense, does it? And I have to tell people it's not supposed to make sense. But I'll tell you how it happens. I think if you've never really thought through the pro-life arguments and the pro-abortion arguments, that you walk into OB-GYN training and you just pick up, you're like a child. You don't know medicine yet, and so you're underneath teachers. And just like being a child, you tend to pick up the views of what you're told. This is medicine. This is a part of medicine. This is how we help women. Women get this choice. Especially if you're not walking with God, it's just easy to be led into that and even be prideful about you're the one helping women and other people won't. I also had a very lovely mentor. I was in Utah. There weren't that many women in medicine in Utah at that time. And this woman, I would call her a soft feminist. She was very loving, very caring about women, and very pro-choice. So again, the people who we are under, and if you're not walking with God and haven't thought it through, it's easy to just say, this is just something that I need to do. And this is what we do in medicine, and so I'm going to shut off my brain and just do what's in front of me that I think I have to do because this is the compassionate thing. And I think people need to understand it. People are trying to be compassionate, but when you don't have God, you get the answer completely wrong. Taking the life of the baby is not the answer. I think also medical training has changed a lot, and this has been very intentional on the side of the abortion industry, which partners with organizations like the American College of OBGYN to promote abortion. When I was in training, it was what we call opt-in. It was not considered a part of our training. It was not required to do abortions, but you could opt into doing them. So you actually made the choice to step into it. Now, since about 2016, it's what they call opt-out. And again, this has been very intentional. It's now a required part of OBGYN training, and you have to, in a hierarchical system like medicine, which in some ways is like the military. It's hard to step in there and go, I won't do this because of a conscientious objection. You have to actually go to them and say, this is against my conscience. And it may have big impacts on your career. So they're doing this because it turns out 86 to 93% of OBGYNs will not perform abortions. And so they're trying to force OBGYNs and now other medical professionals to do abortions.
Okay, now Dr. Wheeler, would you be willing to share when you had your first conversation about abortion?
Yes. So I was in residency in the 1980s. In the mid-1980s, I was in medical school in New Orleans. And you would think that I would have heard about abortion then, and we actually didn't. This was at Charity Hospital, Tulane. When I went to residency in Utah, was the first time it ever came up as a conversation. And again, there was no ethical discussion of it. There was a complete dismissal of the baby. I find that fascinating because in obstetrics, we know we're privileged to have two patients that we care for. But all of a sudden with abortion, we didn't talk about one of them. So we have to have these conversations with our young people to prepare them for what they're going to see in the real world so they know what is true about abortion in the developing baby. and they're ready when they're confronted with these secular views of the world.
Thank you. I'm glad I asked that follow-up question. Dr. Wheeler, some argue that in cases of lethal diagnosis for babies, abortion is the more human choice to prevent suffering. What's your take on this?
Yes, this is such an important question. And the media likes to use the word lethal. I would call that, and I think most people now would call that life-limiting. There's a few things I would say about that. First of all, doctors can be wrong in their diagnosis. I've certainly seen that. Doctors are also very poor predictors of how long a baby will survive. I know somebody who has a child with anencephaly, where the brain doesn't completely develop and the skull doesn't completely close. That would have been considered a lethal diagnosis. This child is probably 8 years old now. I know people with children with trisomy 18, also called Edwards syndrome, and they were told their baby would die. And some of them have babies that are at least 7 to 8 years old, if not older. So we are not good predictors. The next thing I'd say is it's really interesting to me that when the baby is in the womb and they have special needs, that our society says, actually, why don't you just start over? Which is the ultimate discounting of that child. You'll never get the same child again. But once they're born, all of a sudden we protect them as special needs. I think that's an important consideration. The other very important consideration is people don't consider what the baby endures. The baby who has special needs in utero actually is not suffering. So the baby is not suffering at all, and yes, it's hard and tragic to think that your baby may not survive. On the other hand, their life is precious and valuable from the minute of conception through their entire natural life. Abortion is actually incredibly painful for babies. Some of these babies in third trimester abortions, they're literally poisoned, and it can take them hours to a day, and about 5% of them will not die with the initial poison and will have to be poisoned again. So they do suffer with abortion. They're not suffering in utero. The last thing I'd say is I've met so many people with special needs babies in this situation who, and this surprised me even as a pro-choice person, because I always thought, wow, that must be so hard. They should have a choice whether they have to face this kind of a life with a special needs child. But to a person, they have told me the impact of this child on their life, on their family, how they have brought joy, taught them how to love, taught their children how to be loving and compassionate, and that they couldn't imagine their life without it, although they've also told me it's hard. But they have all told me to a person just what value, what beauty and love and joy this child brought to their life, and how they couldn't imagine life without them.
Thank you so much for that wonderful explanation. Dr. Wheeler, it seems to be in the news frequently that without abortion, women will not be able to be treated for miscarriages and ectopic pregnancies. Is there any truth to this?
The short answer is no. The abortion industry is attempting to conflate induced abortion with miscarriage. The medical term for miscarriage is spontaneous abortion. That just means that the baby died prior to 20 weeks of pregnancy. So they're trying to conflate the two, but they're completely different. With a miscarriage, the baby has already unfortunately passed away. And about 80% of the time, no treatment is necessary. When intervention is needed, in the other 20%, it is legal to provide miscarriage care in every single state in the country. This is not an induced abortion, and abortion bans do not affect miscarriage care. Now, an ectopic pregnancy is when the baby has not reached the uterine cavity before it implants at about day 6 after fertilization. And so the baby's implanted somewhere besides the uterine cavity, most commonly in the fallopian tube. And this is potentially life-threatening to the mother. The baby cannot survive. And so treatment involves saving the life of the only person that we can save, which is the mother. And this is legal in every state of our country.
Thank you for explaining that difficult question. Ladies and gentlemen, our train is slowing down as it is approaching the station. What this means is that today's wonderful podcast with Dr. Wheeler is coming to a close. I know our listeners would like to hear more from our special guest, so I will sneak in a few quick questions. Dr. Wheeler, how can our listeners connect with you if they have follow-up questions about today's podcast?
Oh, thank you. I don't have a specific ministry, but I do have an email. So that would be cjwheeler@icloud.com.
Thank you so much for that information. Dr. Wheeler, what do you want our audience to remember the most about your conversation on abortion and pro-life that was shared on today's podcast?
I think the most important thing I would want you to take away is, first of all, what abortion actually is, which is the intentional taking of life of a developing human being. Secondly, that science tells us, this is, even though, again, religion supports it, science tells us that a new human being comes into existence at the time of fertilization, and that this new human being is unique, never repeated, distinct from the mother, and incredibly valuable. The next thing I'd encourage people to take away is that abortion is actually harming all of us. There are individual harms to the people directly involved, but abortion is changing all of our relationships. It's changing our society. It impacts every part of our society. I'd encourage you with what you can do. I think about the Bible saying that we overcome evil with good. So we don't overcome by condemning people, but we approach this with compassion and find ways that we can insert good, that we lovingly teach the truth and prepare people to know the truth, and that we defend the most vulnerable. And lastly, I'd say for the churches, I think that we have to repent of the things that we haven't done. Being complacent, of not speaking, of being silent, of letting this take a deep root, and to be redemptive and just bold and just ask God, what can we do to end this? Which brings us to prayer. Prayer is the cornerstone of all this.
Thank you so much. And everything you just said is very important for all of us to take in. And then what we need to do is not only be good listeners, but we need to apply what we've been learning. I would really like to thank Dr. Catherine Wheeler for joining us today. I also want to thank our listening audience for joining us for this most educational and inspirational podcast, especially dealing with abortion and pro-life issues. Dr. Catherine Wheeler's story is a testament to the power of change and the importance of speaking out for what you believe in. Her dedication to the pro-life cause and her willingness to share her journey offers valuable insights and hope. We appreciate her time and contributions. Listeners, I suggest you talk with others about the things you've learned today. Remember that your voice can make a difference. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I want to leave you with my favorite quote: "With God, I can face tomorrow and experience His peace today." Hope to see you at our next Abundant Living podcast real soon. This is your host, Dr. Bruce Oliver, signing off for now. Don't forget, Jesus loves you.
It has been great to have you join us for today's podcast. Did you just receive a blessing? If so, will you provide us your comments and questions about today's subject? Check out our podcast schedule and join us for another special guest speaker soon. May God richly bless you.